Well, good morning. Well, welcome everybody. So as you can see from the screen, we're going to be talking about the Indian Act today. So just before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself for those of you that don't know me. I'm Michelle Bomberry. I actually used to work here at Polytech, and so it's nice to be back at the Brantford campus. I'm actually a student as well. I have done a lot of things in my career. I'm looking forward to actually just wrapping up my writing. As I was talking earlier, I'm finishing off my PhD, so I hope to defend that at the end of this year. And then who knows where I'll go. But yeah, I really enjoy, instructing. I see some of my former students, so that's awesome. And it's great to see that you guys have pursued post-secondary and are continuing to do so. So I don't really talk a lot about myself because, I'm here to chat about the topic, and that's what I want to do. So when I speak, I want us to have a dialogue. So by all means, if you have a question, and I may actually ask you guys questions, feel free, to talk. That's what we do. So how many people know the Indian Act still exists? Perfect. Good. So what do you know of the Indian Act? What are those really prominent areas of the Indian Act that you know of? Go ahead.
We weren't considered people until the 1960s because according to the Indian Act, being indigenous meant we weren't human.
Okay.
These different guidelines regarding marriages between male, female, and how that has changed in the last 20 years. And also the restrictions that are placed on us living on the reserve, and how for the longest time we weren't allowed to leave the reserve without special permission, had to carry something, and had a curfew and everything.
Yep. So you've talked about some of the points. The Indian Act is actually that. It is a piece of legislation mandated by the Canadian federal government. And so I should do a whole piece on history, but I think you guys got that from, I've actually done this talk twice, so I won't delve into that. But just to understand, and as Tracy mentioned, we weren't viewed as humans. And so you can see the literature, hi Melissa, actually called us savages. And so it's all there, it's all documented. And I don't bring that forward. I always try, whenever I'm instructing or sharing information, trying to bring forward positive, strength-based, because I know who we are today. And I think we were that before because I look at where we come from and those learnings and teachings that we once had. So today we're going to look at just snippets of the Indian Act. It is a large document. But before I get to that, I want to actually hone in on the word Indian because I know some people get very offended. This word is still used. This word still describes who we are. It is legislation that is out there. So we have to use it. And I always use my dad as my example, because the common term we hear about today is indigenous. And my dad is always like, I'm not indigenous. They say on and he has the orange card, and actually in the presentation you'll see the white card, but he has a really old orange card. And maybe I'm telling on him because maybe we shouldn't have those anymore, but he does. And he's like, it says right here, I'm an Indian. And he holds true to that. And I know, telling a little bit more about myself, when I was an elected councillor, going out into community and conversing with the elderly, our senior population, there are individuals who refer to themselves as Indian. That's what they grew up as, that's what they know. And so I appreciate that, and I have to honor their words. And so I do that. But as we evolve, terms have evolved. So, the Indian Act was put in place, and then, pardon? Indian, yep, yeah. So we'll pick up on that when we get to that point. Thank you. So we've gone from Indian to First Nation, to Aboriginal. And if actually you look in the Constitution, in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, we are defined as Aboriginal, right? And so there's all these terms that are out there. And so, again, reverting back to my dad, he's like, you know what? The legislation says we're Indian, we need to stay with that name because that's what holds our rights. And so I will use the term Indian because we are talking about the Indian Act today. But I mean, I encourage you, whatever you use as your proper terminology to describe who we are is on you. Okay. So just a short little timeline on the Indian Act. So you can see that it was developed in back in the 1800s. So that was, you know, a few hundred years ago. And so this act has really defined who we are as a people. Now, I just want by raise of hands, do you think it has defined who you are? I think it has, but what do you think? Do you think it has? Raise your hand. If not, yeah? No? Interesting. How come? You're sitting first row.
Well, because it's something that we've always lived by. And
Yeah.
we've always been under those rules. So yeah, that does define, based on the restrictions and the allowances, shape the person that I am.
Yeah. And I would agree. I mean, that's exactly how I look at it. From some of the things, and I've actually used Johnson's book on the 21 things you need to know or you should know about the Indian Act. I use a lot of his quotes and examples, but there's so much to know. And it really has framed how I have grown up and how I define myself. And so one of them being, and I'm kind of jumping around, but being on reserve. The Indian Act is for those of us who reside on the reserve. If you're off the territory, totally different. And so we'll get to that point. But yeah, in 1867 is when the legislation came into play, and there was parcels of land set aside for us who were Indians to live on, which I would say, I don't know that those pieces of land were the best pieces of land. I'm sure every one of you sitting out here, and for those of you that don't really reside on reserve, probably have visited Six Nations and see that we're pretty swampy. I mean, there's a lot of wetlands at Six Nations. I always say the word swampy, but when I was on the Environment Committee, they told me, Michelle, the proper word is wetland, so I should use the proper terminology. And then you can see as we evolved, as we had these discussions, and I want to say, you know, our people were pretty smart. They were quite intelligent, because if you look at the treaty we signed, it is signed as long as the grass is green, the waters flow. I put that in the wrong order, but I'm like, that is just, that's perfect, because our ways of being will be there for, I would hope, eternity. I mean, the environment is looking a little bleak sometimes, but our people were quite genius about that. So in the 60s and 70s, which really isn't too far off, we wanted some changes to the Indian Act. And so you can see that we've slowly made some changes. 85 was huge in regards to status, and we will really hone in on the discrimination this act has caused women. And then you can see that in the last 20 years, there have been minor changes. And even though it's an act, there have been amendments along the way. So I'm honing in on really what we read from the very beginning, because you know, I was born in the 70s. This has really shaped who I am. Even though there's been amendments, sometimes we're not advised of them. But when you grow up in a certain way, you have a certain way of knowing. And so this is what I think is precipitating behaviors. And you know, I often hear when you're out in these big circles, you know, you guys get everything. Why do you guys have so many issues? And I'm like, holy smokes, you obviously don't know the history of our people. Because you know what? Had I been scooped from my family, because my family means everything to me. My mom and dad, fortunate for me, I have them still. They've been my rock. They've been able to discipline me. They've cared for me. They've loved me. Had I not had that, I really don't know where I would be. So, people say they say these comments and stuff, and I really think you really don't know. You don't know the history of Canada. And so today we're just going to look at a glimpse of that. And I think a lot of people know a lot of the changes of 85. 85 seemed to be that prominent year. So just to give everybody a snapshot of what are we looking at here. So does anybody know how many First Nations there are in Canada? Take a guess. Oh, I should have brought some gift cards. Who wants to take a guess on how many First Nations there are in Canada?
Ask Colt.
Colt, you know. You guys know, yeah, you're my former students. How many? Nope. That's closer in Ontario.
800,000.
Nope. Just the First Nations. How many First Nations in Canada? Come on, we talked about this last week. 634. And so when you think about it and you look at that map, there are so many of our people, and we are a fast-growing population that have been impacted and are still impacted by this federal legislation. So just taking a glimpse of it, you can see that we have a high percentage of, actually it's almost equal, of on reserve and off reserve. And for those of you that don't understand what I'm saying when I say on reserve, off reserve, because for me, that's my life, right? I know what on reserve means. It means those individuals who reside on a band-owned land. And so what we would call a First Nation, ours being Six Nations. So there are a lot of, there are more individuals who reside off. But again, I think if people had choice, if our history didn't impact people's thoughts and ways of knowing, I would think we would have a lot more individuals residing on the reserve. But in saying that, in contemporary times, we really don't have the land for individuals to be at home because of, I always say, and I said it earlier, I mean, we do have a lot of wetlands, and so you can't really build houses in the middle of a pond or middle of a swamp. And, I think all of us have been impacted some way by what surrounds us, but we make the best of it. So I do want to say, I think, and I have friends who've resided their entire life off reserve. We do look at the world very differently, because we are impacted socially by different things. And so I would say living on reserve, you do have a different lifestyle. So when you think about that and put that into perspective, there's a lot of different behaviors and a lot of stories right there. And how do we shape and encourage our people to do what we know is right as being Unguhomi people? And actually, let me just let's actually just clarify that. I said that, we're defined. The government continues to define us. We evolve with our terms. But at the end of the day, and what I've started to do, excuse me, is call us Unguhomi. That is something that was also taken away from us, is our language. And so in order for us to reclaim, and I don't even want to say reclaim, because I think truly we've always been who we are. Sure, we've been molded by this piece of legislation, but we really do know the traditions of culture. We need to relearn the language. And so I think if we all have an opportunity to speak, which we all do, we should be doing that. I'm not fluent, and I'll tell you that. I'm learning, but honestly, it is hard. I don't know why. I find learning the language very difficult. So I say the basics, and you didn't even hear me open up in introducing myself, but I can do that. And, I really hope one day that I will be able to sit in Polytech's White Pines room, able to facilitate in the language while the whole class is understanding me. I mean, that is ultimately the goal. And so when you think about that as well, if we have over 600 First Nations in Canada, and again, I'm only speaking to First Nations. I'm not speaking to the Inuit population. We have the Inuit in Northern Canada as well as Métis. And we can actually get into a dialogue about Métis later on, because when you look at how we define membership in the section Bill C3, I actually question, is there space for them? Because the government has created these different definitions of where you fall in membership. I would think then Métis individuals should fall in there. And so then that would mean we really have First Nations and Inuit people in the country. Okay. So these are some of the areas we are going to touch on this morning. And, I want to put this out to you. I want you guys to picture this, because let me ask this question first. How many people, because I asked this wrong last week and I got totally different answers. Who defines who you are? Your parents? Who defines you? Go ahead.
The world around me defines who I am.
Okay, can you elaborate on that?
The world's reactions to my thoughts, behaviors, and expressions define who I am.
Okay. So maybe I asked that question wrong again.
That's just not like.
But no, that makes that.
What's the answer you want?
I mean, someone was defining us, right? And so yeah, you're on. Like, I appreciate that.
If I'm a complete rude individual to all of you, you guys are making that definition up. Like, your interpersonal reaction to me is I'm a rude individual, and that's going to define me as I move through the world, is people's perceptions of my behaviors.
Yep. And actually, that's great. That's great you said that, because that's exactly what happens. And that's how we socially construct people, behaviors, all of that, right? So everything we do in life is constructions, right? It is, when you think about it. And that's that piece of sociology. I'm actually teaching sociology here too. So we had this conversation last week and we'll pick it up tomorrow. But what I really want to pick up on is that, yes, the world around us defines us. What happened in the Indian Act is the federal government defined who women were. So that to me was the biggest, I guess, I don't want to say issue, but it was. It really impacted who could be First Nation and who couldn't. So I think a lot of you know, individuals were enfranchised, women were, if they married non-native men, right? So that was prior to 85. I mean, you don't see that today, and you see that our women and men are intermarrying, having racial marriages. But that was something that women, I mean, you could do, they always had choice, but that choice also came with, I would say, a consequence. However, what do you think for men happened? Again, I mean, I didn't preface the Indian Act as a discriminatory piece of paper, a piece of legislation. But as we go through this morning, I think you may understand and might have that opinion of this later on. So what do you think happened to our Ongohoe men that married non-Oklahoma women? Anybody? Take a guess.
Women got the status and it was passed down to the children.
Yeah. So for those of you who didn't hear, if you were non-Oklahoma, so non-First Nation, you actually gain status. So, you know, two things there. I just don't know how that can happen, but where in the world does that happen? Where is it that, and it actually does happen, but people's ability to determine who they are is governed by a piece of paper and politicians at a higher level. That happens, and it happened to us. And so what do you think are some of the effects of that? Oops.
Well, women would have moved away had they married, and the traditions weren't passed down. Tradition teachings were passed down to the children. Whereas on the other hand, like non-natives were taught all that, and they were never raised that way before. So I think it's a way of how they wanted us to assimilate. I think it was the government's way that, oh, we put white people in there, they'll start following their ways.
Yeah.
Even though they're considered status, they'll follow white ways.
And I mean, you just hit the nail on the head. The whole act is about assimilation, right? Because you have to remember and premise this back when we had contact is the settlers thought, hey, these people, I mean, we had lands, we had a lot of resources, hey, we want to take them. So then they constructed this idea that we were, as you use, non-humans or savages. You can read in the literature that we were looked at as savages, and you can see that, you know, the residential schools, which we'll get to, spoke to killing the Indian in the child. And so for me, it's very similar to what you're saying, is that the whole purpose of this, was to assimilate us into that wider society. Go ahead.
Also, we were savages who were led by women, because that's one thing the settlers didn't understand, that the men would always seek the advice of the clan mothers. And they didn't want to deal with women because they thought of women as second-class citizens, while for Native women treated with such regard. So they wanted that out because women were even seen as lesser
True.
at that time.
True. And so just picking up on that, so yeah, well, let's look at the context of pre-contact, right? Matrilineal society, so very matriarch, and we looked at our women as they were. We held them up in high. So when you think about this and having the Indian Act define who women were, it really then impacts how we look at the world. And so I see it today. I know sitting at those tables, I always find that it really feels like the men have the final say. And so I would say, I think there's slow change, but you know, I look at who's all here today, and the majority is women. And so as we, you know, move forward, I would think and I would hope that we're able to bring back what traditionally we used to follow. So let me just jump forward to it's really forward. Defining who we are. And so, as I said, you know, women were enfranchised, but as time and this evolves, you can see there are different sections under the Indian Act that defines who we are. So those individuals prior to 85, they have their status, they're 6-1s. Individuals or members after are 6-1Bs. So, you know, I have to give credit to Margaret before she retired, she came and did a presentation to our class. And I always try and bring our experts in because our community has a lot of knowledgeable individuals. And so when she went through this, it confused me because I'm like, holy smokes, what does this all mean? Like, go ahead.
Also, what I realized, because where I work in the summer at Vixio, our funding and our federal funding is based on all of these, like, if you're 6-1, oh, you'll have more funding for this, but if your bills, like, under each of these amendments, it's another way that they're controlling us because our funding is based on the numbers under each of those categories now.
True. Like when you talk the priorities, is that what you're talking
Yeah.
about? Yeah, I see that. And, you know, it's our band list, our membership is what it's called, continues to increase. And I actually haven't looked into what it's increased now. I think at Six Nations we have over 28,000 band members, and I believe almost 18,000 are residing on the territory. So you're right. It's really impacting our contemporary way of life, and you hear the differences in community too, right? Like it's reality of, you know, there's individuals who are going off to post-secondary, and I just heard this because I sit at the GRIPSEO board, and you know, a lot of our community members are feeling that it's our off-reserve band members who are going off to post-secondary, and it's our on-reserve individuals who don't, or they get more money. So what I'm going to point out is because of this legislation, you see othering happening. And the othering, I think, is impacting us greatly. And that's, you see it, right? We have traditional, we have elected system. And how do we bring everybody together? That's always been my goal, and that's actually why I ran as an elected councillor, because I really do think we should quash the system, because there is relevance in our traditional system, but we're not there. I think we are so assimilated into the ways of what we have today, and I am too, but in order for community to come together, I think we really need to figure this out, because if we stay with this, the federal government will continue to tell us what we can and cannot do. So again, I will not elaborate on this because membership isn't my forte, but you can see this is one small example of what the Indian Act has created for our communities. And so, like I said, maybe we can have this discussion now. I don't know if anybody here defines themselves as Métis, but I know growing up, Métis were always referred to as half-breeds. So it was, you know, our women met up with French settlers, and they had, you know, children, and so they were defined as half-breeds. As we evolve, and like we talked about at the onset, terms evolve, so we got rid of that term, and we're talking about Métis. But I really think when you look at the sections 6.1 and 6.2, that they actually do fit under here. And so I'm still doing a lot more research, and I don't want to, you know, offend, but I guess it's all right if I offend, because then that piques conversation. Is there are a lot. So in one of my previous professions, I was the director of scholarships and bursaries, and the number of Métis councils that emerged in the last 10 years is unreal. And so for me, I'm like, okay, we have to look at this, because you know, it's not, I find we're at a place in society today where people want to be us. And I'm like, why do you want to be us? Like, I mean, look at our history. And what people see is, oh, we get free everything. And again, I want to dispel that rumor, because we don't. I mean, there are some probably First Nations, and I know there are First Nations out there that do get compensation. But honestly, when you look at the psychological, the emotional effects of what this act and all of those pieces that those structures that were put in place, how they've affected us as individuals and our families, you know, free money doesn't do anything. Honestly, money isn't the answer, in my opinion. Money does help, but I mean, it helps to give people those supports that they are needed. So this is huge, because at the end of the day, if we continue to get more people who might not have that experience that we lived, because I see everybody here and you've lived it. I know, I know you from the community, and if we then have other people who are like, well, it's not too bad, it's not this, it's not that, we don't need this, then what actually happens to our treaty rights? Because there are people that come on the ban list that don't know anything about us, right? And so these pieces and amendments to the legislation are fueling that change. So again, let's then jump into residential schools. I don't really focus a lot on residential schools because I would think, and here I go assuming, everybody here understands residential schools because of where we are at Six Nations, where Polytech is, where the mush hole is. I mean, if you don't understand that, I'd be very surprised. But I do want to pick up on the fact that this is exactly, and I like your description, Tracy, that we were never viewed as human beings. And so when the government, we helped. When you think of the wars that were had, we did. We were allies, we helped out. And here at the end of the day, the British then put this commission together to assimilate us. And how were they going to do that? They were going to take our kids from their parents. And I get it. Some of us have had, rough upbringings, and I can understand. I mean, their history, like I said, precipitates some of this. But at the end of the day, we always have this one person or maybe two people who have raised us, who've been there. And to me, when that's taken from you, it would really impact your way of life. And so that's exactly what this commission did. They put together the residential schools, and they actually instituted the Gradual Civilization Act, because again, we weren't viewed as being a civil person. However, I would really disagree with that, because I mean, we lived and were able to man the land, harvest the food. We knew how to do that. And I mean, and I think, and I'm hopeful that our families are slowly doing that again. I know there are families that are doing it, but not to the, I think, extent that should happen. So just looking at how this commission was started, I mean, that goal of assimilation, key in all of this, right? Because they want us to be just in the social fabric of Canada. You will not be like First Nations people. You're not Ongwahumi people. And so these are three huge I guess, constructs that they put forward. One being residential schools, two being the 60 scoop, which I don't hear much about, and I don't know how many of our members actually went through the 60 scoop. I really never ever hear that, but I would look into that a little further. And then we look at child welfare, and that still exists. So even though communities are like, yeah, the residential schools are closed, I would say child welfare, it's on the increase, and it is the new residential school. Trevor?
To further add to that list of, killing the child, is Indigenous youth have been over-incarcerated in youth prisons across Canada during the same period, right? If we could remove them and place them in residential schools, we would remove them and place them in jail.
Yeah.
Prisons. And that's still going on today. That over-representation is growing.
Yeah. And I mean, and we could actually, piggybacking on that, we are overrepresented in a lot of things. I actually did some work last year up in Winnipeg, and it is really sad to see how many homeless people are living in Winnipeg. I mean, you see it here in Brantford, you see it at Six Nations, but when you go to Winnipeg and you come off that airport and you go, just drive down the road, I'm like, wow, our people are everywhere. And so I always share. There was a guy that I got to interview, and I'll call him. I was gonna say I use the name Trevor. I won't say it 'cause I'll call him Tyler. So he had told me. So there's this. Sorry, I'm just going off on a tangent here. But they have this group for men's wellness because there's so many men who are on the streets, and there was women too. But honestly, the majority seemed to be males that when we were walking the streets, that's all I chatted with. And so Tyler, he, after like our 4th time meeting, he said, yeah, I'll sit down and I'll chat with you. Because you got to remember, right, here I am, I'm working for this company, and they do want to do well and make change for the men, homeless men or men at risk of being homeless. But, he has to build trust with me. He's not just going to tell me his story. So yeah, it was about the 4th time we chatted, and he sat down and, he's like, I'm 19 years old and I've been in 13 different foster homes. And I'm like, wow. Like, to me, that doesn't happen, but only to our people. Like, I am just, and I say this because I'm focusing on our Ungohongi people. But when he started to talk and the abuse that he encountered at the majority of those homes, I'm just like, you know what? Canada needs to understand that, they really are trying to assimilate us, but the psychological distress and the abuse and the feelings of loneliness and hatred on oneself is really taking a toll on our people. And so I'm like, Tyler, what could help you? Like, what kind of supports do you want? And like, he didn't know, right? Because he was 19 years old and all he knew is he needed to survive. That's all he worried about. And so you know what? We think we can put all of these plans in place and we can have these real cookie cutter approaches, but it really isn't. And I look at that even in a class. I get to instruct every term, and every student is different, and I can appreciate that. And I know we come into the world with different stories and different life experiences, so I have to understand that, and we just don't take the time to do that, I think, when we're doing programs. Question?
That's also why how we were talking with the settler colonial generational trauma. A lot of that racism and hatred and stuff has been passed down, and a lot of the effects that we're feeling is due to what they've experienced as well. And it's ingrained in their head, no, these guys are down there. We treat them like they're down there, and I think that has been passed on as well. That ideal, how we are less than human. Because I spoken to somebody who said her sister's kid was going to be taken away by a child welfare because they just thought, this is just recently, they're from a reserve up north, because they didn't think they had the stuff to take care, and the family had to come. But it's because they live differently. How you said some of them follow the traditional way. So their cupboards may not be full with canned food, their freezer may not be full with hamburger, could be moose. People don't understand, so they think, well, no, that's child abuse, you're not feeding them properly.
Right.
Whereas our diet was healthier for us, and that's why you see more Indigenous people who are diabetic, because we are following the white man's diet. Our bodies weren't made for that.
Good point. Yeah. And it's true, I think maybe I'm dating myself. Some of us grew up without houses, right? We had that experience. And so, we would probably be called upon today.
My husband thought we were poor, because I took him to Graham, or my dad's. At that time, he hadn't built the addition, so there was no running water, there was no toilet. I had to take him to my grandmother's, use the bathroom. And he goes, you guys are poor. It's like, no, we just don't have it. Not poor.
Yeah.
It's just how we live.
And again, I just want to pick up on that, because when I was in that elected counselor role, you know, for me, I actually hope everybody does have potable water, has the, you know, sewer and the abilities to live safely and healthy in their home. But I remember going to actually one of our seniors' homes, and she's like, no, this is me. I don't need that. And she thought it was the you know, white man's way, is what she told me. And I'm like, okay, I got to understand that. So I was, you know, putting what I thought was what we all needed. So again, you know, even though, and I always think of my dad, because he knows what he knows because he grew up in a certain way, and that's how he sees the world, and we all do. And so I really had to step back and think, okay, yep, that's where she's at, and maybe in time she'll want some, you know, indoor plumbing and stuff, but that's for her to tell me, right? I can't impose myself. And again, I learned that here I am imposing what I think is supposed to happen for all community. So she was a good reminder of, you know what, okay. She reminded me, yeah, you know what, traditionally, and she was living fine, right? She was actually enjoying her life. And so I was doing this whole blanket approach, which I had to remind myself that, you know, we are assimilated. I always say, back when I started my PhD, my friends and I would talk about how do you decolonize, because those words are out there, right? The truth and reconciliation. We always talked about decolonizing, right? Because we're colonized. And I'm like, well, how do you really decolonize a colonized? Because all we know is that we're colonized. We don't really know anything before that, right? Because the Indian Act's always been there, and it's really directed how we think, how we do. And so, I mean, I say that for myself because I've been here, you know, 47 years, and it's had a huge impact. So child welfare still exists today. It's actually really, oh, I didn't even go through this. But you can see that, sorry, Dr. Bryce actually, he was an individual, he was an ally that wanted to help us. Like I said, I wasn't going to, you know, focus in on residential school because I think there's been so much literature that if you don't know about residential schools, I don't know what to say. But Dr. Bryce was somebody who really wanted to help us help our kids because he's seen the deplorable conditions. He's seen, you know, the food that the kids were eating in residential schools. I mean, that shouldn't happen. But again, so what do you think happened to him? Right?
His report was ignored.
Yeah. And so again, it's shelved, and here we are. Those conditions remained. And, you know, we continue to we lost individuals. But picking up on today's residential school, I look at child welfare, and I just, you know, have to tell you this story. My family, we used to be a foster family, and, you know, on the Friday night, so we did the respite care. We actually didn't. We would bring in my children's friends. I should just say my son because he's older. His friends would come and live with us, but I never ever thought of them as foster kids. But they were actually kids from Children's Aid that we would, you know, bring to our house on Fridays and for the weekends. And I remember, you know, these brother and sister, and I really like, you know, siblings because it's unfortunate to say that they were apprehended as siblings, but I wanted them to stay together because honestly they had the bond and they trusted somebody, they knew somebody. And those Friday nights when they would come to our house, they were in tears. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing this, right? Because they didn't know us. And they were just, they had created a safety net with their foster family, be it good, be it bad, but they knew there was structure, right? And here they are coming Friday night to us. And I would always think, oh my gosh, maybe we shouldn't be doing this because look at, they are so sad. And, you know, come Saturday, they were, you know, warming up to us. Come Sunday, it was like, okay, what are we doing? But again, to me, I think that impact that I witnessed, it sticks with me because how many of our kids have gone through that? And you know what? Then we expect them to go to school on Monday. And it's just, it hits you, right? So when I was actually teaching, I thought, okay, how many of our kids are actually in the system? And how many spend time away from their family? How many do you think? What do you think this number is? Do you think it's in the thousands? Do you think it's in the 100,000s? What do you think? Number of nights our kids have spent away. And this is just for 8 years.
Probably about half.
Oh, where is it? Uh-oh, it's gone. It is 27 million nights that they have been away from their families. That number is like unreal. And so I actually give credit to Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who has done and spent her entire life advocating for our kids in the system. And you know what? It's sad to say, because this, I think, is our biggest issue right now, is the child welfare system and it molding away. I get it. We have First Nations who are doing child welfare within their communities. We have it here at Six Nations. But I think for me, and this is only my opinion, those are other systems. Those systems aren't meant to be overseen by us. And maybe they shouldn't be in our community. We should be following traditionally what we know. You know, I see people here who you guys are friends, family, and I'm just like, why can't we do that? Whatever happened to that breakdown? Because I remember as a kid, we would be at, my grandma's, your grandma's, because we're family. But that was that community, that close-knit family, and we would help each other out. I mean, we do help each other, but not like it used to be. And that's where I'm thinking, why do we have to have systems come in when our families know what we need to do? So again, there's this legislation that really governs over, and I think I don't know if they really think they are doing any good, but at the end of the day, I would think the goal has always been assimilation. So I'm just backtracking here. Okay, so we've looked at 1 and 2. Okay, so let's move on to reserves. What do you know about reserves? We kind of touched on it earlier. What are the reserves? We have over 600 reserves here in Canada. I think maybe every...
Crown-owned land that we are designated, that's where we live.
Yeah. So this is what I want to pick up on, and it was quite interesting when I did this talk before, because I know some individuals don't understand this. So I always put it in this context of business, because I do talk to people who say, you know what, you guys have beautiful homes at Six Nations, and you have this and you have this. And I'm like, yeah, we do have mansions in the community. We do have a really lucrative tobacco industry, and maybe now you can say cannabis industry. But at the end of the day, because we do this othering thing, right? We compare. And so, when I'm at school, I tell people, you know what, you think that being on reserve is equivalent to being off reserve. But you know what, I have a house, and I actually can't use it like you would be able to, right? So I don't know individuals here who have, who reside off reserve, right? Some of you do, right? So you probably own your house, and you have title to your house, and you can use that as an asset when you go to the bank, right? And that's great. And,
All of us, right? So,
okay, and so yeah, but when you own your own house, you'll be
working on it.
right on. But and this was where I found was so odd, is that my house, I couldn't use it as collateral when I wanted to buy a house off the territory, because I've been advised I don't own my house. So all of you that live here, I mean, who reside at Six Nations, you have a certificate of possession. You possess that house, but at the end of the day, the government owns that piece of land, right? So people don't get that. They don't understand. And so I'm like, you know what? At the end of the day, the non-Indigenous peoples actually squatted on our land in Canada, and now we're feeling the effects of it, right? When you think about it, because we had this breadth of land, and now we're struggling just to even make ends meet. And so people that I've talked to, and you know what? I am at university, and I don't see a lot of our people there. Actually, I'm the only one in my class. So having these conversations, it's always like you're advocating for us and you're always teaching. And so they're like, that can't be. How can that be? And I'm like, it's right here. It's the Indian Act has created what a reserve is and what limitations we have. And they're like, okay, then why don't you just leave? You know what? It seems like, you know, it's community, and some people don't understand that. But we do have different outlooks on life, and it's not just about leaving. And so that is a huge difference. We don't have title to the land. And so it really puts, I think, our community members, mind you, I mean, I could go off reserve, and I should have done this 20 years ago and bought a house, and then I would have had an asset, but I didn't. And so here I am today with homes, but that they don't mean anything. So again, reserves, one, don't have the same equivalency as you would off the territory, and two, they aren't in the best of places. I would say that for Southern Ontario. So remember I said that because I look over in Sarnia, and they are situated, they have, oh my gosh, oil refinery? They have the big oil refinery. And so the health effects that they're experiencing, right, that's happening there. But let's flip to the north. What do you think of their reserves?
They don't have much amenities, however, they're sitting on a lot of natural resources
Yeah.
that the federal government owns.
Yeah. So for those of you that didn't hear, they might not be as lush and as, you know, I guess mobile as us here in the south, but in the north, they are rich with natural resources. And so what does that mean? Yeah, right? The government, the corporations, that's what they want, and they're exploiting our people in the north for that. And so again, it's like, it's hard, right? We can't win either way. And so the reserves have done that, and there is, you know, as we look further, there was a time actually when even agriculture, it's not on here, it was on here.
Sure.
Oh yeah, you could lease out your land to non-Indigenous people. And I remember that. And they could come and take or use the land and take what they needed. And so again, the act lays out so much, not for us. Another thing that actually, another stipulation in the act, it restricted us from leaving the reserve. So now that has been amended. But I do remember, and actually the participant at the last conversation that talked about this, is before, I think it was in the 50s, 60s, individuals wanting to leave the territory had to ask permission. And so, I mean, that is, to me, that's a really abusive relationship we got, right? Because if you have to ask to leave the territory, somebody's obviously in control. And so that happened. And I remember my former boss, she would say, you know what, even though that happened 50 years ago, that impacts and stays with her every day, because she knew somebody could tell her when she couldn't and could go off the reserve. And so, you know, last week, and for those of you, I mean, we all, I think, went through the pandemic, And you've seen that the elected system, we had established permits, right? And so if you were a band member, you actually got the little permit. And that actually had individuals regress to that time because you were allowed to come on the territory if you had it, right? And if not, you couldn't. And so, you know, that is something that we really need to be cognizant of, is those mechanisms we put in place. You know, we thought at the time we were protecting community because we knew that we have a lot of visitors at Six Nations. People visit our territory every day for, you know, cigarettes, whatever. And so at the time we thought that was the best thing, but never did we think about how that would impact our senior population. Okay, so I'm just going to finish off with, I guess, the bullet number 6. And so what the Act also did, and this is where I really want to just hit home, is people always say, you know what, why don't you guys go to school? You get it for free. And I'm like, you know what? In the Indian Act, it told us if you actually went off to post-secondary, you were no longer an Indian. And so, you know, that's really sticks with people. And so I think we're seeing a change now, because we do have a few more people going through post-secondary. I think the last time I read, when I read last year's annual report, there was over 700 Six Nations students in post-secondary, be it college or university. And so to me, though, that's still a small number for how large our community is. And I think, you know what, even though this has also been amended, it has its lasting impacts. There's so much we could talk about the Indian Act. As I said last time, it's a course on its own. So I tried to condense it into our talk this morning. So if you have any questions, by all means, I'll hang around. But with that, I'm going to end it now, and maybe we'll do another one in the future. So thanks, everybody. Meow.